Okay, my name is Joe Bielecki. I'm an officer of the Czechoslovak Room Committee at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm president of SOCAL USA. And in the past, I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in history, a law degree. I had a Fulbright scholarship in 1982, one of the first years that Eastern Europe was open to Fulbright scholars to visit and engage in projects. And I had also studied for some time at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, in Russian East European Studies. I'm asked today to give a talk about why Slovaks emigrated to the United States in the period 1880 to 1920, and also what they found when they arrived. To understand this topic, you have to look at Slovakia in that time period. Slovakia in the period 1880 to 1920 was a very rural society. There were very few big cities. The population was approximately 4 million, and it was very primarily agricultural and rather poor in comparison to many other countries, both in Europe and in North America. The 25 to 30% of the Slovak population emigrated during this time. You had a very big depopulation of the country as people went westwards to achieve economic opportunities and better lifestyles. Many who chose not to go to the United States went to places like Vienna or to Budapest, large cities that were beginning to get into the modern era via industrialization. The Slovak population was fairly young at that time too. Now, why was it young in this period 1880 to 1920? It's a very interesting phenomenon. During the early 1800s, you had the Napoleonic Wars, and the French army battled all the way to Russia and back to Paris. Europe had been devastated. Many agricultural lands were in ruins. It took people a while to get back on their feet and return their lives to normal. And then you had another interesting force that occurred outside of Europe. You had the American Civil War. The American Civil War resulted in a very interesting phenomenon in Europe. The United States had been a market for European goods for many, many years. The North-South Civil War took the United States out of the commercial sphere. And the United States also was supplying a lot of goods to Europe in return for products coming from Europe. The products coming from Europe at that time were generally finished goods, metalwork, glass, more complex productions, and the American exports were agricultural. And so you had like cheaper products coming, like grains, tobacco, cotton, for example, for the textile production. And when the United States was out of the service in terms of trade because of the Civil War, you had a period of about roughly 5 years, and then subsequently, because of the Reconstruction occurring in North America, during this time of the Civil War and the Reconstruction, the American goods weren't coming. And so other countries were picking up the market. Russia and Ukraine, Crimea, they started producing vast amounts of grain. Argentina also produced large amounts of grain. They exported beef and huge numbers of agricultural products, soybeans and things like that, to European markets. And so minor areas, and I use that term loosely. I don't want anyone to take offense at the term minor, but Slovakia was not a vast country, so its agricultural production became important during these years because the people could produce grains, they could produce wool from sheep, they could produce many agricultural products that were being sold for a greater value because there was no longer the competition from North America. And so the peasantry, the people who lived in the countryside, who worked in farms and agriculture, became wealthier during this interim period, say like 1860 to 1870, 1880. And as part of their wealth, of course, they developed their houses, they improved their lifestyles, but many families had more children. And this factors into the phenomenon of emigration to America because by 1880, the United States was back into the swing of things with agricultural production, and it was also beginning to industrialize. And so everything was taking off in North America, and the market was being flooded with cheaper grains. The prices of agricultural commodities fell all over Europe. And so the peasantry, the farmers in the countryside, their lifestyles fell as well. And other areas, because of mechanization, were experiencing similar lifestyle and living standard crashes. For example, people who manufactured goods by hand, like spinning and weaving of textiles, processing of woolens, and things of that nature. Those things were now becoming mass-produced in American factories or in factories in London. And so you had this bubble of the children who had been born in the 1860s, early 1870s, in the prosperous times. Now they're reaching the period of their late teens and young adult era. They're like 18, 19, 20, and there's no work for them. The villages are overpopulated. And suddenly comes the realization that there's this whole new world in North America waiting, and that there'll be work and jobs for them. And the first people began coming to North America, roughly 1880, the first big wave. And it became like a chain migration. They would tell people in their villages, they would write letters back, they would send money to their relatives, and their relatives would see like, wow, this person, they're writing in their letter, they're telling us they're living, they're having this, this, and this, which we don't have. And so the desire came, more and more people began to emigrate, and huge waves of people began leaving. By 1912, which was the peak year of emigration to the United States, Ellis Island was processing 20 to 30,000 people a day from immigrant ships, perhaps even more. That year was the greatest immigration. It was Ellis Island alone saw more than 2 million people cross its thresholds. At that time, the main train station in the city of Pittsburgh saw 20,000 people arrive on what they called the immigrant trains. That there were certain harbor cities, New York, Baltimore, and a couple other places where the immigrant ships landed from Europe, and these people would get on the trains after having been processed through the immigration clearances. But 20,000 people a day. And what were these people like who were arriving at that time? First, they were young, generally roughly between 18 and 24, 25, because the jobs that they were getting here were more physical. They all knew that the labor that they would be able to occupy in America was more physical labor, but industrial. Or coal mining. In rural areas, the labor was mining, but it was still, in a sense, industrial labor. Generally, they were men. People, for the most part, did not come in family units. Often the men arrived first, and they either married here or they sent, if they were married back home, they would later send for certain of their relatives, like, perhaps some of the children, the wives, their brothers, their sisters, whatever. But that term is chain migration. So, generally they were single people coming. These people, in addition to being young, were often not very well educated by today's standards. For example, in 1912, in Slovakia, there were only 4 high schools in the entire country. Think about what America is today. Look for example, in the city of Pittsburgh, you have many, like 20, 30 high schools within a short drive of the city, maybe even more than that. And Slovakia, a country of 4 million, had 4. And the language of instruction in Slovakia was actually Hungarian, because they were in the Hungarian portion of the Habsburg Empire. And the official language for the eastern half of the Habsburg Empire for administration and education was Hungarian, even though it was a multicultural area. Croatia was part of that section of the empire, so was Transylvania, so was Bosnia, so was parts of Romania, parts of Ukraine, but the official language was not their own linguistic language of Slovak. It was Hungarian. For the civil service administration, even in village education, it was done in Hungarian. And so the educational level was fairly low. Most people who came here from rural parts of Slovakia had no more than a 3rd grade education. Essentially, they were able to do basic reading, write their names, do some basic handwriting, but that was about the full extent of education there. Even if you lived in a big city in Slovakia, if you wanted to go to a university, you had to leave Slovakia. There were none. So what did people find when they arrived here? This was the initial arrival in America was, in a sense, one day of amazement after another. The United States, 1880 to 1920, was in a very intense period of industrialization. The great cities, New York, Chicago, were taking off. Building of large skyscrapers, everything was happening. In cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Milwaukee and Buffalo, you had gigantic steel factories that required all kinds of heavy labor to support their work, to generate their products. And so you had a very highly mechanized society that these new immigrants were coming into. And it is no exaggeration to say that it would be like plucking someone from a very agricultural area in, for example, South America, or rural part of Asia or somewhere, and dropping them in Silicon Valley. The culture shock was huge. You had people coming from rural villages that never experienced electrification, that had no electric lights. And in fact, it was not until the late 1920s, early 1930s that all of Slovakia was electrified and had light bulbs in homes and electricity in homes. So people were coming off the immigrant ships. They were coming into this huge, very, very modern society. Everything looked alien. Most of these people did not speak a second language. If they did, the second language was another language from the Habsburg Empire, like Hungarian or German or another Slavic language. English was incomprehensible to them. They came to cities that had cars, trucks. New York had already, at that period, hundreds of tall buildings. Electricity was everywhere, and it was one marvel after another. Even the concept of trains. There were not that many train connections in Slovakia. You had to go to, say, like Budapest or Berlin or Prague. Their experience with technology was so limited, and they came here, and it was the equivalent of being dropped into Silicon Valley. And it's a very interesting testament to their experience that they had all adapted so quickly. They were given jobs. They found jobs in steel factories where there were moving parts of machinery that were 3 or 4 times the height of a 6-foot man. There were people who were going underground, working in coal mines, working with drilling technology and explosives and things that they would never have fathomed encountering. And in a sense, their technology became even part of their lifestyle because they were moving into homes. In the cities, most homes had some component of electricity by 1900, like electric lighting, gas stoves for cooking. Cars came a bit later. They came more closer. They began to increase in numbers in big cities in America in the 1910s. And by the 1920s, they were very widespread. And as you see from the visuals that are unfolding on the screen, you see the mechanization. You see how dense the urban cities were. For example, you see a picture of the south side of Pittsburgh, where there are hundreds of little tiny row houses clinging to the hillsides. These were very different from the rural countryside, spacious areas that they had left. Everything was completely different. The cities were often polluted. Housing was often overcrowded because these people were poor. They began having large families. But it was a completely different setting from Slovakia. The factories were the key to the great wealth. The cities were very wealthy. You'll see a couple photographs on the screen shortly of, for example, Carnegie Museum, and how that was all generated by the wealth that came to Andrew Carnegie through his steel factories. One of the phenomena that was most interesting that occurred with the arrival in America was the very rapid desire to change and become American and fit in. Even though the cities were like, in a sense, multicultural, like for example, like Bosnia, in a sense, multiple languages, multiple ethnic cultures, everybody quickly discarded their traditional kroy or their folk clothing. Many people arrived from Eastern Europe in general, wearing what was at that time their Sunday best, their village costumes, the folk kroy that we so value today. And they arrived and they felt out of place in America, and that was one of the first things from their cultures they discarded. One of the last things that people gave up was their ethnic cookings. They preferred many dishes from their homelands over the American styles of food, but they quickly took on many facets of the American way of life. And almost from the early arrival, Americanization and the desire to fit into the society became very important. And so you first saw the jettisoning of clothing. They valued education more here, and so they pushed their children to at least finish the 8 grades of public school. More than 8 grades did not become commonplace in most of America until around the time of the Second World War. High schools, even until the 1930s, existed, but very few people actually completed 4 years of high school. And that was because of economic settings. But as the technological expansion of the United States lifestyle expanded, high schools became more important than college and education in general. So the immigrants experienced a gigantic leap. In one generation, they leapt from a very agrarian, rural, pastoral lifestyle to a highly mechanized, highly technological lifestyle change. And it is an amazing accomplishment.